today. Lessons from data retention that Australia didn't learn, and the sheer scale of it. Your host is Rick Falkvinger, and this is Liberties Report.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Good evening, and welcome to Liberties Report Week 44. The principal news this week is that the Australian administration has tabled a bill for data retention. This is a misleading term that should really be called the "We're watching everything you do, so behave" program. On December 14, 2005, the European Parliament voted in favour of mass surveillance legislation that went far further in invading people's privacy than anything the East German Stasi had ever had. The effect of this new legislation was that every citizen's every footstep through every European city would be logged and recorded, as well as whom they communicated with, how, when, and from where. This was a major detour from the presumption of innocence and the right to privacy that had been the norm before, that the police had right to breach privacy only on concrete and individual suspicion of a serious crime. When I stated in 2005 that this law was considerably worse than what Stasi had at their disposal, that statement wasn't taken seriously. But the idea of putting a governmental tracking device on every citizen, their mobile phone, and having them pay for that tracking device themselves was simply something that had never happened before. And the effects were rather immediate. In Germany, over half of people surveyed had stopped placing phone calls that could conceivably be used against them at some point in the future. Phone calls we want people to make, ranging from drug helplines and suicide hotlines to much more mundane things like psychologists and marriage counseling. This mass surveillance wasn't effective either. It was justified by the usual bogeyman, terrorism, and then used for basically everything else. At least that was the selling point. But for all its immense harm, it didn't do much good. You couldn't possibly justify the mass surveillance even from an efficiency standpoint. According to another German study, blanket data retention made a difference to 0.002% of criminal investigations at most. That's about the same efficiency improvement as hiring one more investigator, except the method of data retention costs billions and violates the entire citizenry wholesale. The only ones rejoicing were the copyright industry, had fought hard for this communications logging in the pipe dream of thinking it would reduce the sharing of culture and knowledge in violation of their distribution monopoly. It did no such thing, of course. So, on April 8, 2014, European data retention was finally torn up by the roots by the European Court of Justice, the highest court in Europe. The court not only ruled that data retention must stop immediately, but ruled retroactively that the law mandating it had never even been in effect. So for almost a decade, these wholesale violations took place in large parts of Europe. And so this week, with all of Europe's experiences in hand, Australia's administration decided that data retention sounds like an absolutely brilliant idea. Most people reacted to this presented bill by stating that the Australian administration sounds like they're absolutely brainless and dim. To nobody's surprise, it was also stated immediately that this Australian mass surveillance and mass violation would be used by the copyright industry, violating a whole country's fundamental rights to maintain a crumbling distribution monopoly for a cartoon industry. That's just onion-esque. In 2005, comparisons to Stasi could be brushed off. With all the studies in hand, however, and still proposing a data retention law with an effect so small it doesn't even show on radar, while, on the other hand, violating everybody. That goes beyond the reckless and irresponsible into the territory of the despotic, tyrannical, and sadistical. I hear a lot of people still claim that comparisons between today's NSA-level surveillance and the East German Stasi are unfair. They're correct. It is unfair, but not in the way they think. In an apples-to-apples comparison, a German team has illustrated how much space today's mass surveillance archives would take up if they had used the same technology as the East German Stasi did. So, pure apples to apples. The Stasi archives took up 2 large buildings in central Berlin, after all, illustrated on the left in this map. When you ask people how much space today's mass surveillance archives would take up, some people guess slightly less, some people guess slightly more. Maybe 3 buildings? No, the shade on the right, representing today's surveillance, is larger than 3 buildings, maybe a block. Let's find out. It's not 3 buildings, it's not even 3 cities. It's half of continental Europe, the entire Middle East, and a good chunk of northern Africa. So it's entirely correct to say that comparisons with Stasi aren't fair. Today is worse at about a factor of 1 billion. 9 orders of magnitude. Yes, 9. We still have a lot of work to do to restore the most fundamental of liberties. But the verdict from the European Court of Justice earlier this year was a good step in the right direction. I'm Rick Falkfinger, and this is Liberties Report. Visit our sponsor, Private Internet Access. Good night.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Liberties Report is produced using exclusively free software.